So this is a video I've been going back and forth on making for a while, and recently I decided, you know what, I think people need to know about this. So long story short, the issue is that Shimano Dior 12-speed cranks seem to be coming off, loosening off by themselves, and coming off sometimes while people are riding. Now I know this because this has actually happened to me, and initially I thought, okay, maybe it's just I did something wrong, something happened, it's a fluke, whatever, I wasn't injured. So I said, okay, whatever, I'm gonna forget about it. Then I started looking into it. And I looked on some forums and people were saying, yeah, this happened to me. My Shimano Dior 12-speed crank came off while I was riding. Yesterday, I'm on Reddit, I'm looking at the MTB subreddit, and this guy makes a post, it's a video, and it basically says, always check your bolts before you ride. And it's this guy hitting this gap jump, and then his crank falls off halfway through. So I'm thinking, wow, this must be a problem with cranks. And then I look in the comments, and it's a Shimano crank. SLX, not Dior, but it's a Shimano crank. So I'm starting to think that maybe this is a bigger problem than I previously thought. And I'm not doing this to scare people or doing this to whatever. I'm just doing this because I think people should know, and it could save you a potentially really bad injury from having your crank fall off while riding. So today, I'm gonna talk about what the problem is, what happened to me. Then I'll go into what I think are the potential causes of the problem. Again, somewhat speculative, but I have some theories, which I'll give. And then I'll give you some insights, or at least my insights, into how to prevent the problem from happening, or a remedy to the problem if it has already happened. All right, so story time real quick. What happened to me with this issue? So I'm going for a bike packing trip with my friend. And this is neither here nor there, not really relevant to it, but I've been begging this friend to go bike packing for over a year, right? I was like, come on, dude, let's go bike packing. He was always busy. I don't want to. I got stuff to do. I don't, blah, blah, blah. Finally, I convinced him to go bike packing with me. So I'm super stoked, ready to get out there. 2 minutes into the climb, and I'm not joking, 2 minutes into the first climb of the day, I go to pedal and I just get nothing, right? I'm like, what happened? Like bike's not moving forward, pedals aren't working. I look down and my cleat, right? My pedal is just stuck to my shoe with the crank arm, and it's not attached to the bike. And I'm just thinking, gosh darn it, right? Like I'd been begging this guy to go bike packing for a year. We're finally out here, and this is the ride that my crank arm falls off, right? So yeah, the crank arm's just completely off the bike, right? There was no real warning. It wasn't like rattling or anything like that. It was just 1 second it's on, the next second's off the bike. Now, thankfully, I was able to essentially just get my multi-tool, crank down the pinch bolts as hard as I could, and I was like, I'm gonna finish this ride. Probably wasn't the smartest thing in the world, but the crank stayed on the rest of the weekend, didn't fall off, and when I got home, I tried yanking on it, and it was on there. However, just the day before that, I was out at, if anyone knows, UC Santa Cruz, which has some really fun, kind of technical trails, steep jumps, all that sort of stuff. And had that fallen off in the middle of one of those jumps or on one of those steep trails, it would have been a really bad accident, right? I could have seriously hurt myself. And so ultimately, I decided, you know what, I need to figure out what's going on here. So I get home, start doing some research, like I said, look on the forums. People are saying, yeah, this has happened to me too. Before I get into what the potential causes of this are, I do have one more quick story to tell, which I think has to do with the potential causes. So about 2 years prior to this incident happening, this falling off, a friend of mine said, hey, can I borrow your bike? And it's my Ibis Ripmo right here, which he has to borrow. And so I said, sure. So he borrows the bike, and then he uses it all weekend. Then I get it back from him, like, hey, how's the bike? And he's like, oh yeah, it was great, but the crank arm fell off. And I was thinking, okay, that's strange. But he worked in a bike shop. He's kind of a tinker sort of guy. So I figured maybe he tried to do a bolt check and just left it loose or something, which is a possibility. But I didn't really think twice of it, right? He reinstalled the crank and was like, yeah, it's good to go. And then I rode it for essentially 2 years with no problem until this fell off. So what's causing this then, right? If we have these crank arms falling off, multiple people have talked about it. It seems like it can cause some pretty bad accidents if it falls off mid-jump or on a steep downhill. What's causing it? Like, why is this happening? I've never had a SRAM or a Race Face or Truvative crank fall off, right? Why are these Shimano cranks falling off? Especially if this specific system, right, the 2-pinch bolt with the preload cap, that's been around for a long time. It's not really a new thing. So there's a couple theories. Now, some people online think it has to do with the fact that the Dior cranks specifically are just made of a lower quality aluminum, and it's essentially just getting brittle over time, and then it slips, okay? And that's potentially true. The second thing that I noticed when I was looking on the forums is that most of the people who complained about this problem, or at least a lot of them, I don't know about most, but a lot of them were on this specific bike, an Ibis Ritmo. So with that understanding, I have two theories, right? One is I assume that the cranks are installed at the factory, not by the bike shop, right? When the bike shop gets the bike, it's probably in a bike box with the cranks installed, handlebars off, wheels off, right? And then they just kind of assemble it the rest of the way. So it's possible that the Ibis factory just didn't torque these down properly, right, at the initial time. These need to be torqued on pretty tight. I believe it's 12 to 14 Newton meters, if I'm not mistaken. And that's a good amount of torque, actually, for such a small pinch bolt. So if at the factory they're just doing it, you know, what feels tight, or if they're doing one all the way and then the other way, you really have to do these a little bit at a time. That could potentially be causing this problem where they're not torqued down enough at the factory. Now, that being said, I do think a bike shop selling a bike, right? So if you're buying it from a bike shop, which I did, they probably should be checking the bolts before they send it out to the customers, right? You would hope that the factory does it right, but when you're the bike shop selling it, at the end of the day, it's going to come down to you. I think that's going to be your responsibility. And so if the cranks are, or if the bolts are loose when you get the bike, it's your job to make sure it's good to go. Now, that all being said, I'm still going to take responsibility for this because at the end of the day, I do work on my own bikes, and admittedly, I hadn't checked the crank bolts in a while, and you should be doing periodic bolt checks. Now, to counteract my own argument here a little bit, you know, this really isn't something that should be working its way loose, right? Like a crank bolt, I've never had a crank bolt come loose on any other bike, and I've had a lot of bikes, right? All sorts of cranks, Campagnolo, Truvative, SRAM, they don't come loose, right? So I don't really know. Yes, like I should have checked, but these should not be coming loose, especially after a relatively short amount of time. My theory is that the cranks are not necessarily to blame from the beginning, that they work. However, if someone does under torque them and then they slip off, they get damaged because they only engage with these splines right here. I'll do a close up in a second. They only engage with these splines. And I guess if you have this loose and then you turn the crank, right, you pedal with it, it's probably gonna essentially ruin the splines at least a little bit and make them less likely to hold properly, which will then ultimately make them less likely to stay on there, and eventually they'll work themselves loose. One last thing I want to mention before I install my new cranks. So the Shimano cranks do actually have a fail-safe kind of built in to prevent this problem from happening. Essentially, there's this little tab here, okay, and mine is broken in half, which definitely has something to do with the fact that I had this issue. And essentially, it fits over these two bolts here, okay? And then there is a sort of little like nub, little metal nub, which is broken off on mine, which then interfaces with the spindle of the drive side crank. There's a little hole you can see on the crank here. And essentially that nub sort of clicks into there, which in theory would keep it, it would be loose, right, if the pinch bolt's backed off, but it wouldn't fall off, which would then give you time to say, hey, my non-drive side crank is loose, I'm gonna go tighten it back down. Again, to add to the kind of idea of the repetition of this problem is that if your cranks come off once, this little thing is for sure going to break, right, or most likely going to break, which means the next time it gets loose, you're not gonna have this fail-safe in place. So you wanna make sure that your little lawyer tab, as they call it, as some people call it, if you wanna make sure this is intact and there, right? Because there's a good chance that if your crank has already fallen off, that this is broken and no longer doing its job, which would potentially at least prevent you from losing the crank while you're riding, at least in theory. All right, so with all that being said, what I'm gonna do now is I'm going to install my new SLX cranks, which use the same system as the Dior cranks onto my bike. And as I do so, I'm gonna give you a few pointers that I think will help minimize this problem from happening to you. Now, before I do any of that, I'm gonna say this is kind of the point of the video, all right? This is not fear mongering. This is not meant to be like, oh, Shimano sucks or whatever, right? The point is, check your bolts, okay? If you have a Dior SLX, XT, XTR crankset, right, 12 speed, this has happened enough times, okay, anecdotally, that I think it's a potential issue, okay? If you work on your own bike, check your bolts. If you don't, bring it to the shop, have them check it out. There's a good chance it's fine, but it could work itself loose. And if you already do check your bolts, maybe check them a little more frequently, okay? Just because, again, this could be a really catastrophic problem if it were to happen while you were riding. All right, so let's go ahead and head on over to the bike. We're gonna install my new SLX crankset, and I'm gonna show you a few things that I'm going to do to prevent this from happening again, as well as the proper way to install the crankset so that you can make sure it's done properly if you have a bike that's potentially affected. Okay, so here is my new crankset. Let's go ahead and open this up. Okay, non-drive side. Here we have the preload, and here we have our drive side crank. Okay, all right, let's get this out of the way. All right, so here we can see the lawyer tab, right, is intact. And it's right here, it's lifted up right now. Okay, see right here? That's, you can push it down, you can lift it up, okay? And that's the way it comes from Shimano. You can also see that they've greased the bolts here. I do think that Loctite would be a better idea on these bolts. You don't want these coming loose, right? They're probably not going to freeze on there, and I'd rather they be tight on there rather than coming loose. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these pinch bolts out. Okay. And when we do that, you can actually see what the lawyer tab's supposed to look like. So you can see here, it has this little nub right here, if you can see that, this little metal nub right there. And that's what interfaces with the little hole in the spindle. And so in theory, right, even if the pinch bolts come loose, this would at least hold it in so it's not flying off. Now again, this is a really small thing attached to a plastic piece. So if you, go off a jump and then land, this is probably going to shear off anyways. So, I don't know how much it's really doing if you're riding your bike, aggressively, but that's the idea behind it. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to get some of this thread locker. This is liquid moly, but you can use Loctite or whatever, okay? This is removable thread locker, okay, medium strength, and this will prevent them from backing out, at least in theory. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take my bolts, get this grease off, because we don't need to grease these bolts. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my bolt here, and I'm going to get some thread locker on there. Don't need a ton. Just like that. Spread it around a little bit. Like so. And then we're just going to let that cure for 2 minutes before we get it all installed. Now here's something I noticed, and it might be a little bit hard to show on camera, but I'm going to try here. So this is the old crankset, the Dior, the one that fell off. If you see here, so the splines, right, they're right here, okay? And this is what interfaces with the spindle splines right here, right? So these guys would interface like this, right? And then you put your preload and whatever. Okay, and that's what actually keeps them essentially where they're supposed to be, right? Those splines and the interface between the two of them. The splines though, let me show you the new one. Okay, the splines are only on the front kind of 2/3, I guess, right? More than half of the crank arm, as you can see here. The back is smooth, right? See this right here? This is all smooth. On the one that fell off, as you can see here, if you can hear that, I'm gonna be quiet. That is no longer smooth. There's essentially some mini splines now cut into it. Now, my guess is that the first time this came loose and fell off when my friend was riding it, that damage must have happened, which then probably also means that these splines that actually do hold it on also got damaged to some degree as well. So maybe this is a case of what people are saying, a sort of lower quality aluminum being used with these Dior cranks, or just the fact that once they fall off once, they're probably going to fall off again. But I did notice that there is quite a bit of damage. Quite a bit of damage. Let me see if I can zoom in. Yeah, there you go. You can see quite a bit of damage here on the part that is supposed to be flat, as you can see here on this SLX crank. That this right here is smooth, and on the other one it's all damaged. So, okay, so it's been 2 minutes. Let's go ahead and get these pinch bolts installed again. So first we have to feed this one through the hole of the lawyer tab. And then we're not really going to go tight. We're just going to get these on so they don't fall off. Loose like that. And then this guy goes right here. Okay. And now let's go ahead and put this on the bike. Okay, so last thing, before I install the crank, so this is the actual Shimano preload cap. You can see here, it's plastic, first of all. And second of all, you have to use their sort of proprietary, like, lobed spine tool, this guy right here, which is fine in the workshop, but if you're out on the trail, there's no way you're tightening this with your multi-tool, which is why I'm going to use this aftermarket one from Bergtech, because it's aluminum, right, rather than plastic, and it uses an 8mm, which I do have on my multi-tool, same as pedals, and so if I do need to tighten it, hopefully I don't, but if I do, I'll be able to. So I'm going to use this guy. I think it looks better too, because it's not, you know, plastic. Okay, to the bike. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and get this installed. So first things first is we are going to slide in the drive side crank. And you can see it pops out right here. Okay. Then we are going to install our non-drive side crank. We're going to make sure that our little lawyer tab is lifted up using this tool. Okay, so that's up. And then we just slide this over. And then this needs to go down. Okay, now it's on there. And now we're going to go ahead and take our preload bolt. And we're just going to get that installed here. Make sure it's not cross-threading. We really just want to go sort of snug and a bit. Then we want to test to see if there's any play. There's still a tiny bit of play, so I'm going to go just a little bit tighter. Okay, and then these should spin freely, which they do, but there should be no play, so I can still hear a little bit of play. A little bit tighter. Still spins freely. And you just want to sort of keep going until you get the right amount of preload. That feels good. Right, I can still spin and there's no play. Okay, that feels good. Okay, now we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna take our pinch bolts and we're just going to snug them down. We're not going tight at all. These are still rather loose. I'm just going a little bit at a time to do them evenly. That's making contact. Now this one's making contact. That one's still making contact. Then I'll give this one a little half turn. Give this guy a half turn. Get back to this guy a little more, okay? Again, we still have good movement, okay? We have no play, let's check that again. No play, excellent. Okay, now we're gonna break out the torque wrench. Okay, now we've got our torque wrench right here. And we're gonna go ahead and set this to 14 Newton meters. Actually, what we're gonna do, we're gonna do this actually. We're gonna go and be really careful. We're gonna go to 8 first. Okay, so actually I'm gonna start off at 8. I'm gonna do that first. We're gonna tighten this in stages. So I'm gonna get this guy, do a little bit, I'm not torquing yet. I'm just going a little bit at a time, keeping them nice and even. Still not torqued. That's 8 on that one. Go back to this guy. That's 8. Double check this guy again. Okay. Now we're going to go to our next setting, and we're going to go up to 11 Newton meters, which is right there. And we'll do this guy. A little bit, not torqued yet. This guy, a little bit. Back to the first guy. That's 11. That's 11. Now we're going to go to our final torque, which is going to be 14 Newton meters. $14. Check the first one again. 14. And 14. And I believe that is all we need. There we go. Crank is installed. So that's it for this video. I think the ultimate crux of what I'm trying to say here is you gotta check your bolts, okay? This is an issue, right? Multiple people on forums, on Reddit, myself included, have had non-drive side cranks fall off while you're riding. If you're lucky, it's while you're climbing. If you're very unlucky, it's when you're descending or hitting jumps. This is something that needs to be addressed. So check your bolts, okay? As you saw, 14 Newton meters really is quite a bit of torque, okay? I was putting quite a bit of effort into getting them down to the proper torque spec. So use a torque wrench, check your bolts, make sure they're 14 Newton meters, go a little bit at a time to make sure this is, you know, that it is actually being properly torqued down and tightened. And a little bit of Loctite would not be a bad idea, in my opinion, because you don't want these coming off, right? Mountain biking is dangerous enough as it is without cranks falling off mid-ride. We don't need to add any more spice to mountain biking with this sort of crazy mechanical. So anyways, thank you guys for watching. I hope the video was informative. I hope it was helpful. If you've had this issue yourself, please let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to hear about it. Hopefully you weren't injured. And yeah, that's it. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll catch you on the next video. See you later.